Hey guys, I'm Danica Davila, and this is my second current events presentation discussing this week's chapter, Chapter 13, which talks about crime corrections and public safety. So I chose this article from the Texas Tribune, and it was uploaded on April 17th of this year. And this article is about how the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the highest court for criminal cases in the state, chose to resentence an offender to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So prior to the sentencing, the offender was on death row for murdering his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter. The court agreed with this decision to give the offender life in prison, citing the offender's intellectual disability as the main reason to not execute him. So from 1976 to 2002, there were actually about 44 prisoners with intellectual disabilities that were executed in the U.S. However, the U.S. Supreme Court determined in Atkins v. Virginia that executing offenders with intellectual disabilities is unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment. In 2004, the offender and his legal team tried to convince the jurors that he had intellectual disabilities, but the court decided to sentence him to death. Many years down the line, the prosecutors and the defense team recognized his disabilities, citing evidence and disapproval of a false testimony given by a psychologist, Dr. George Denkowski. In 2011, the Texas State Board of Psychologists prohibited Denkowski from examining prisoners on death row after they deemed his research methods to be unscientific. And the court also ruled that the psychologist was biased because the offender was Hispanic. Ultimately, the court's slim 5-4 vote approved a life sentence instead of death row for the offender. So this article relates to the assigned chapter for this week because we learn about the classification of crimes in the state. So in this case, this crime would be classified as capital murder because it involves the killing of a small child. Usually the punishment for this is life without parole or death, and initially the sentence in this case was death, but later recommuted to life in prison without parole. And in the third section of the chapter, titled Crime Corrections and the Texas Prison System, we analyze graphs that show the racial statistics of death row inmates in Texas prisons. We also read about the average amount of time spent on death row before execution. It's usually about 11 years, but varies from case to case. In this case, the offender spent about 20 years on death row, given that he was sentenced to death in 2004. When we analyze the chart, we see the racial disproportions, with African Americans being disproportionately represented on death row. In this case, the offender is Hispanic, and Hispanics typically make up about 39.7% of the general Texas population, state population, but Hispanics also make up about 33.3% of a general prison population here in the state, and about 25.5% of prisoners on death row in Texas are Hispanic. Ultimately, the broader importance of this article beyond the classroom is that whether we disagree with capital punishment or we agree with it, we should reconsider death row cases involving intellectual disabilities, as well as emphasizing a fair and just trial for all prisoners, especially for those with intellectual disabilities. This article also shows how significant it is for the defense team and the prosecutors to be cooperative in eliminating injustice within our legal system, because the article talks about how the cooperation from both the prosecutors and the defense team recognizing the offender's disabilities is rare. So the fact that there's already a good amount of injustice in our legal system, that the defense and the prosecutors, who are usually against each other in the courtroom, agreed on this thing is very significant, and I think in the future we can see a lot of progress in eliminating injustice in our legal system.